Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Jack the Ripper. These serial killers are just some of the most famous, even beyond the true crime community. Despite being only responsible for about 1% of murders in the United States, serial murderers are truly some of the most terrifying people in history, often motivated by a determination to fulfill some kind of twisted desire. But amongst the Peter Sutcliffes and Zodiac killers are dozens of criminals barely mentioned when the topic comes up. In today's episode, we'll be exploring 3 nightmarish serial killers you've never heard of. Vicki Dawn Jackson. In 1989, Vicki Dawn Jackson became a licensed vocational nurse and found employment in hospitals and nursing homes during the 90s. Then in late 2000, she joined the staff at Nocona General Hospital in Nocona, Texas, a facility for mostly treating elderly patients with slight ailments. Spanning the months of December 2000 and February 2001, the hospital noticed a bizarre surge in patient deaths. Many of these individuals were between the ages of 62 and 100 and had previously been rather healthy. Still, nobody suspected there was anything amiss. It was believed that the deaths were due to the patients having weaker immune systems and, in some cases, simply being old. But soon afterwards, a rumor began circulating the facility. Someone was killing patients. This allegation persisted, and eventually, the hospital's administrator spoke with a pharmacist about the fact that vials of Mivacron, a muscle relaxant, had gone missing around the time of the deaths. He had believed this was simply an inventory mismanagement, and noted that it was not generally considered a lethal substance. Mivacurium chloride is used to briefly paralyze an individual's respiratory system. This allows doctors to insert an oxygen tube. Once oxygen begins flowing, the drug quickly wears off. But in high dosage and without an oxygen tube, it can be deadly. The hospital administrator also discovered that all the deaths occurred during a particular shift. Following all of this, he ordered that the cabinets with the Mivacron be locked up and only accessed by supervisors. Soon, a joint investigation by the local police, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI was launched to investigate the deaths of over 20 patients who were potentially murdered with the muscle relaxant. The bodies of numerous patients were exhumed as well, now that investigators knew what they were searching for: evidence of poisoning. At this same time, a civil lawsuit was filed on behalf of 61-year-old Donnelly Reed. The suit claimed one of the hospital's nurses, Vicki Dawn Jackson, 34, had injected a drug into Donnelly's IV tube. While he initially survived the incident, as another nurse came to his aid, he passed away 2 months later after contracting pneumonia. A week later, another lawsuit emerged, this one alleging that 87-year-old Boyd Burnett had been injected with an unprescribed drug by Jackson, which led to his death in December of 2000. Jackson was fired in February of 2001, before the lawsuits were filed, when syringes with traces of Mivacron were discovered by law enforcement in the bins at her residence. After leaving her nursing job, she became employed at a local deli. It was here that she was arrested on July 16, 2002, on charges of 4 capital murders. As she awaited trial, the authorities continued to look for answers, exhuming bodies and searching for further victims. The trial was scheduled for October 2004, and a gag order was issued on the case. The only detail made public was that the persecutors were not seeking the death penalty. In January of 2004, 6 further murder charges were laid against Jackson. After her first trial resulted in a mistrial, another was scheduled and set to take place in San Angelo with a brand new jury. During this second trial, FBI Special Agent David Burns claimed that during interrogations with Jackson, he believed he had determined her motive, that she'd murdered patients in fits of rage after deeming them as too demanding. She had reportedly attempted to injure numerous other patients, including a 14-year-old girl and a 40-year-old with Crohn's disease. However, Jackson told the agent that she did not know why she felt the need to kill. Prosecutors suspected that having several failed marriages and losing custody of her children was the straw that broke the camel's back and led Jackson to commit the horrendous string of crimes. An interview with Jackson in Texas Monthly, dating back to 2007, revealed that she did have some personal grievances with a handful of the victims. One, an elderly woman named Donnie Jennings, would repeatedly strike and spit on nurses for not complying with her demands. Two victims had relatives who had bullied her in high school. One 62-year-old man sexually harassed her, while another victim had an evangelical son who would repeatedly tell her troubles would be fixed if she joined the church. However, she had no real ties to the other victims. Jackson eventually pled no contest to 10 capital murder charges and accepted a sentence of life in prison to avoid having her daughter testify against her and to skip the jury trial. Special Agent Burns testified because when the no contest plea was entered, the prosecution still had to present evidence to the judge. Jackson went on to release a statement after her conviction, claiming she was innocent and expressing sympathy and solidarity with the families of the victims. She attempted to seek a new trial in 2015, but it appears this was dismissed. Jackson is still behind bars in Gatesville. Her earliest chance of parole is in 2042. 𝐒𝐿 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢, born in 1952, is one of Poland's most terrifying serial killers. Dubbed Frankenstein and the Vampire of Bytom, he stalked the streets of Bytom, targeting women in the Upper Silesian industrial region between 1975 and 1982. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢's crimes reportedly began when he developed a hatred for women following a stint in jail. Aged 18, he was convicted of participating in the gang rape of a young girl and sentenced to 3 years behind bars, and despite the available evidence, believed that he had been falsely accused and should not be in prison. As a result, he spent time stewing in his hatred for the opposite sex. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 attempted to commit his first homicide on November 3rd, 1974, when he attacked 21-year-old Maria Baruka in the stairwell of her apartment block. Maria was bashed over the head, but managed to survive the ordeal. She also saw her attacker. The next known attack occurred on September 20th, 1975. The victim, named only Stefania M., died in the hospital. A month later, he took the life of another woman, Elżbieta Mikołajczak. On May 6, 1976, 38-year-old Mirosława Sanowska was killed. She was the key witness against another killer, Zdzisław Marcicki, dubbed the Vampire from Zagłębia, after she had seen Marcicki execute his final victim. Notably, she had been murdered in a similar fashion to how Marcicki killed his victims, near her place of residence using a blunt instrument, and with a sexual motive to the murder as evident by the exposure of her lower body. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 did not strike again until October 30th, when he attacked Teresa Rims on the stairwell of her apartment block as she returned home from work. She died from blunt force trauma, and he dragged her body into the basement. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 struck next on January 20th, 1977, although this specific victim survived the ordeal and described her attacker to the police, and then again on February 2nd, 1978 and July 30th, 1978, when he attacked two 14-year-old girls at an amusement park in Chorzów. Law enforcement became involved in the case after the first few crimes when a pattern began to emerge. They noticed that many of the attacks were carried out near the Upper Silesian tram line number 6, and the women who'd survived their attacks were able to help create a composite sketch of the perpetrator. A sculpture was created of 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 with a wig to match his hair, while a mannequin dressed like the culprit was also used. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 often wore a checkerboard duffel coat. The attacker was described as a young, slender man with thick, long hair. Images of the face and mannequin were distributed to police officers in the area, and the tram stops were heavily patrolled. Hundreds of men who were guilty of sex offenses were interrogated. The authorities kept the case quiet, as Marcicki had been executed on April 26, 1977, and yet it appeared a copycat was still operating in the area. Investigators didn't want the public to panic. In 1979, the attacks started up again. One woman was assaulted in March, while 2 girls were attacked on June 23rd. Despite inflicting numerous blows to the girls' bodies, one of them, 𝐒𝐿𝐵, survived after they were discovered nude in the bushes in 𝐒𝐿𝐵. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 was initially arrested in September of 1979. One woman who'd survived an attack in 1977 identified him as the culprit, but he had an airtight alibi, as he was listed as being at work at the time of the murders. Despite bearing a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the perpetrator, he was released. However, this close brush with the law appeared to scare him, as he committed no further crimes until 1982. On May 8th, he killed his sister-in-law, 17-year-old Bogusława Ludźiga. Boldly, he reported the death to emergency services and his family, claiming she had an accidental fall and injured herself. However, semen was discovered on her underwear, and it was determined she'd suffered a blow from a blunt instrument. His motive for the murder was that the pair had had sex, possibly as a result of him sexually assaulting her, and she wished to report it to her sister. On April 19, 1984, 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 was given the death penalty for 5 murders. It was discovered after the murder of his sister-in-law that his alibis were not watertight. In fact, he frequently worked overtime and was given days off in exchange. His supervisor would mark him in for his shift as normal, as this was simply how the company's process worked. Prior to his conviction, he confessed to the murders and expressed remorse. He was reportedly ashamed about the sexual nature of his crimes. 𝐁𝐞𝐥𝐢 was hanged on May 21, 1985, in Krakow. William Devin Howell. Dubbed the Sick Ripper, William Devin Howell is one of Connecticut's more prolific serial slayers. His brutal violence began when 29-year-old Melanie Camellini, a mother of 2 living in Waterbury, vanished, having been last seen on January 1, 2003. She was spotted alive shortly before then with 2 men in the city. According to reports, Melanie struggled with substance abuse issues, and it was not uncharacteristic for her to disappear for long periods of time and fail to contact her friends and family. After she was abducted by a man, later identified as Howell, she was raped, strangled, and hit in the head with a hammer. Her body was then buried behind a shopping plaza on Hartford Road in New Britain, which became Howell's favorite dumping ground. The wooded, marshy area gravesite was found by a hunter in 2007. Melanie's remains were not identified until 2015. On June 18, 2003, 44-year-old Janice Roberts disappeared. She was last seen entering a blue van outside a Stop and Shop in Wethersfield that was later identified as Howell's, who at the time was a drifter who worked odd jobs around the state. 6 days passed before Janice was reported missing. Howell would later go on to tell an informant that he had strangled Janice to death after attempting to coerce her into sex, only to discover that she was transgender. Howell's next victim was 55-year-old Diane Cusack, who was last seen sometime in the middle of 2003. She was last heard from on July 9th, when the police spoke with her in regards to a landlord-tenant dispute. Like Melanie, Diane's remains were pulled from the gravesite in 2007, but 4 years passed before she was identified. Another similarity between the 2 victims was that she also had substance abuse problems. However, the difference with Diane is that she was not reported missing, as she had not been in contact with her family for a long time before she vanished. On July 31st, 2003, a missing persons report was filed for 33-year-old Nilsa Arizmendi, whose family hadn't heard from her in a week. Nilsa was a heroin user and a sex worker who was living in a motel in Wethersfield with her boyfriend. Notably, her boyfriend was a convicted drug dealer, and it was initially assumed that he was involved in her disappearance. He was cleared of any wrongdoing shortly afterwards, however, and told detectives he had last seen the 33-year-old on July 25th at 2:30 a.m. when she entered Howell's blue van. Howell's final 3 victims included 26-year-old Marilyn Gonzalez, a mother of 2 who vanished when she left her home in Waterbury in 2003, Joy Martinez, 33, who disappeared in October that year, although she was not reported missing until March 29, 2004, and Mary Jane Maynard, a a 40-year-old mother of two also from Waterbury, who disappeared in October of 2003. Joy Martinez was unemployed at the time of her disappearance, while Mary Maynard was a former addict who is now working as a substance abuse counselor. Both women's remains were discovered behind the shopping plaza in 2007, while Marilyn's body was found behind the West Farms shopping mall in Farmington, Connecticut in 2015. Howell first came to the attention of police when they were looking into the disappearance of Nilsa. Her boyfriend revealed the couple had allowed Howell to stay with them at their hotel so they could smoke crack together. The authorities took possession of Howell's van in North Carolina, where they discovered that several seat cushions had suspiciously been removed. A forensic examination was carried out that revealed human blood from two people had soaked into the van's flooring, with one DNA sample revealing it was 99% certain to have come from Nilsa. Authorities also discovered 6 different videotapes of Howell engaging in what is described as quote-unquote bizarre sex with women, although they were recorded in such a way that the women's faces were not visible and identifiable. Howell was initially charged with first-degree manslaughter since Nilsa's body was still missing. After his trial began in January of 2007, he entered an Alford plea, which means he did not admit to the crime, but understood that the persecution had enough evidence that a conviction was likely. Howell would, however, later retract this plea, claiming that his public defender had pressured him into making it and that he wished to have it thrown out. He also maintained his innocence, claiming Nilsa and her boyfriend had fought inside the van, which is how her blood came to be on the floor. Despite his insistence, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Weeks later, the bodies of Diane, Joy, and Mary were found in his mass graveyard behind the plaza. While in prison, Howell called himself a sick ripper, which is what led to his moniker. He also told one of his inmates about how he'd kept one of the women's bodies inside his van for 2 weeks after he killed her because the earth was too cold for a burial. He claimed that he'd slept next to her for the fortnight. He then told another inmate that he cut off the tips of one woman's fingers and dismantled her bottom jaw, dumping her body parts in Virginia. In 2017, 2 years after the remaining bodies of Howell's victims were recovered, he pled guilty to all 6 of the new murder charges laid against him and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He reportedly cried and apologized to the families during this time, labeling his actions monstrous, cowardly, and selfish. He told the court he deserved the death penalty, although this was no longer an option since it had been abolished by the Supreme Court 2 years earlier. He added, "I know what awaits me, a slow, painful death in prison. I hope that provides some comfort to each of the families." However, in earlier statements, Howell had referred to the gravesite as his garden and claimed that the women should have known they were going to die because of the lifestyles they led. He is currently serving his 360-year sentence at Cheshire Correctional Institution. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.